And very often, when you come under pressure, you end up by saying, well, it is Korea as a nation. And historians have been discussing this for a very long time. Some of us have tried to elude this question.
지난 겨울 하버드의 동아시아 언어 및 문명학과에서는 한국과 관련해 특이한 강연이 열렸습니다. 강연을 주도한 이는 하버드와 런던대 교수를 거쳐 현재 예일대학교 사학과 교수로 재직 중인 오드 아른의 베스타 교수였는데요. 그는 제국과 의로운 국가라는 책의 저자이기도 한데 이 책에 나오는 의로운 국가는 한국을 의미한다고 합니다. 특히 그는 강연 내내 한 글자를 한국의 모든 것이라고 설명하는데요. 추운 겨울을 잊게 하는 불타는 강연을 통해 그가 한국의 어떤 점에 푹 빠져 책까지 냈는지 한번 알아보겠습니다.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's wonderful to be here. It's a real honor and pleasure for me to do the Reichauer lectures here at Harvard, more or less right after I've arrived at Harvard. Now, in the overall title for these lectures, Empire and Righteous Nation, there are three concepts that I would like to explore a bit at the start of the first lecture. Empire, nation, and righteous. Now, you might have guessed, particularly if you're Korean, that this is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek title for the lectures. Righteous, of course, refers to Korea, but it doesn't mean that all Koreans are righteous, or even that the Korean state at any point or in any form has been a righteous state. It's there to indicate that the search for a righteous approach to domestic and international affairs has preoccupied many generations of Koreans very much. This is something that will be a thread that runs through all three of these lectures. Now, some of my Korean friends would probably argue that I mix up righteousness and rectitude. Now, we'll talk much more about that later on, but just as a forewarning. For instance, some empires colonize, but not all empires do. Think about Ireland connected to England. Think about Algeria connected to France. Now, in many ways, these two countries, Ireland and Algeria, are similar to Korea in the sense that they are right on the border of the imperial center. But in Korea, Chinese settlement over these 600 years that I'm talking about was very, very rare. And the only real attempt at settling foreign colonialists in Korea was, of course, during the Japanese occupation, where almost 1 million Japanese came in to settle for shorter or longer periods of time.
베스타 교수가 이렇게 말한 이유는 일제강점기 이후에 조선을 침략했던 청나라, 명나라 등은 자신들이 조선의 형으로 받들어지며 각종 종이, 비단, 귀금속, 금, 은, 동 등 소위 조선에서 나오는 명품을 바치거나 무역을 트는 방식이었습니다. 강제성은 있으나 선조들이 외교를 잘한 탓에 일본을 비롯한 다른 전범국들에 비해 평화로웠다고 평가되고 있죠. 베스타 교수는 이어서 언어학자들의 말을 빌어 한국이 특별한 이유를 그저 한국이기 때문이라고 설명하는데요.
Let's then turn to the second of my concepts, nation. And here, of course, I'm speaking about Korea. To speak about Korea, and especially pre-20th century Korea, as a nation. And historians have been discussing this for a very long time. Some of us have tried to elude this question by simply pointing to the great coherence in cultural and linguistic terms of people who live on the Korean peninsula. And of course, this is a process that does go back a very long time, at least 3,000 years. In linguistic terms, you're going to hear a little bit about linguistics in these lectures. Not much, I promise you, but a little bit. In linguistic terms, modern Korean derives from Middle Korean, which in turn derives from, you guessed it, Old Korean, which has its roots, linguists believe, in some form of Proto-Korean. So not much change there. Actually, great change in terms of language, but not much change in terms of an overall departure, moving in a different direction. So there is something that's been going on for a very long time here that one needs to think about. China is not like that. Japan also is not like that, or at least not quite in the same way. So in this sense, within its own region, Korea is quite unique. But of course, looking at it this way is a typical historian's cop-out, right? You say that something exists because it's always existed and that you can't quite describe what it is, And very often, when you come under pressure, you end up by saying, well, it is Korea. So I'll try to get a little bit closer to the issue than that. Now, the point is, of course, that not everything that is distinct becomes a nation in any meaningful sense of the term, or certainly not a nation before historians started inventing nations in Europe in the 19th century. I like, by the way, the Oxford English Dictionary definition of nation, which is a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, inhabiting a particular state or territory. And the emphasis here is on something in common and co-location. That's more or less the history of European nationalism in the 19th century. It's about defining who is out, who the nation, who does not belong with the nation. So what then about East Asia, and what about Korea? Now, there are people who argue, and I'm going to talk more about this in a little bit, that Korean concepts of nation is something that go far back in time. Not using the term nation, not necessarily using principles of exclusion, but more in the form that Anthony Smith, my former colleague at LSE, defined nation as a group sharing a historic territory, common myths, and historical memories. If that is true, overall as a definition, then Korea, I think, for quite some time falls into that definition, and perhaps further back than Europe in the 19th century. It is quite possible, it is quite meaningful, at least to me, to think of the form of cohesion that people living on the Korean peninsula had created amongst themselves. And then finally, the third concept, righteous. So, I in Chinese, or Ui in Korean, and you see it up there. That's a good traditional I, not the way it's written in China today, and taken up especially in Korea. So an argument that I'm going to return to a little bit later on is that this Neo-Confucian concept of righteousness is something that has inspired generation after generation of Koreans, elite Koreans to be sure, in order to define the content of their own state. And that goes beyond just the issue of who we are in a kind of ethnic sense. I'll try to avoid using the term ethnic in these lectures, but I'll use it as a one-off here. The concept of the Korean state as being particularly preoccupied with righteousness is something that goes through generations of political philosophers and political leaders within Korea. Of course, it is possible, and Koreans, both during the Ming and the Qing eras, were sometimes attacked by the Chinese for this. And it is interesting how this character has become a slogan for various Korean political projects over a period at least of the 600 years that I'm talking about here. So the Popular Army in the uprising against the Japanese invasions in the 1580s called themselves the Righteous Army, or Uibyeong. And you will find it in the resistance against Japan in the 20th century, and you find it in numerous political upheavals in South Korea towards the end of the 20th century. So it is a significant concept. And that was, I think, because it turned out to be a very successful project, that's what gave it such deep roots. First with the Japanese attempt under Toyotomi Hideyoshi at taking over Korea, and possibly also having in mind taking over at least significant parts of Ming China, and then the Qing attempts at controlling Korea, and the Jurchen, Manchu, Qing attempts at controlling Korea in the 1620s and the 1630s. For a region that saw itself as a world, quite rightly, this was a world war. And it was an enormously testing experience for all the polities that were involved. Two of them didn't survive. And surprisingly enough, the one who did was Korea, was Joseon Korea. Ming collapsed. Hideyoshi experiment went nowhere, ended in tears and defeat. Joseon was the one that survived. And that says something about the internal cohesion that was there. The ability to survive disasters when inflicted on the country. Possibly also, and this is something I'd love for us to discuss later on, because the concept of state was slightly different, maybe for the very reason that Korea was not an empire. was it possible to get some kind of continuity beyond this, as Yahuin Kim Habush has underlined in her writings.
중국도 일본도 한국을 완전히 종속시킬 수 없었던 일 가슴에 새기게 되는 강의였는데요. 의로운 나라 한국이 이번 국난도 슬기롭게 이겨내고 힘차게 나아가길 기원합니다.